All right. Welcome everyone to the TLC conversation today. My name is Valerie Kroll. I will be the guest host of today's TLC conversation because the lovely Kelly Wortham is unfortunately feeling under the weather. So we're sending healthy, positive vibes your way, Kelly. So hopefully you'll be back up soon. All right, so very excited today to be here for the SEO CRO conversation. How many times am I going to do that?
I was going to be salmon. They said they're not going to serve.
If everyone on the who's not on here, let's go ahead and mute here. Perfect. Okay, awesome. Before we jump in and begin our conversation, Kelly had a few announcements she wanted me to pass along. First is the awesome announcement that all of our historical conversations from the TLC are now up on our YouTube channel. So you can head on over to this shortened link to see any of the past conversations and discussions we've had. Go ahead and subscribe and share and all that good stuff. Second announcement is that we have quite a few members actually from Search Discovery who will be joining CXL Live next week. And I saw in the TLC that quite a few of you will be there as well. So be sure to stop by our TLC happy hour. We're hosting that on Thursday evening, and you can grab a laptop sticker while you're there. So that's the plug. And then as always, if you have any topics or suggestions or things that you would love to discuss here with the TLC, be sure to pass those along to Kelly. That's her email address down there at the bottom. Or you can just put it in the TLC Slack. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to today's panel. So first up, we have Zach, who is a senior SEO technical manager here at Search Discovery. He does technical optimization for both B2B and B2C, has worked with lots of big brands throughout his tenure in this space in a variety of different sectors. So welcome, Zach, and thank you so much for participating in today's conversation. Second up, we have Luis, who has two separate roles that we listed up on here. So right now he is a customer success and CRO lead at Mailshake, working to support sales outreach initiatives with his clients, as well as e-commerce, so specializing in content marketing, CRO, and SEO. So you're going to be a perfect addition for today's conversation. Really excited to have you here, Luis. And last up on our panel, we have Wade, who is a senior marketing manager here at Search Discovery. He's been in the digital marketing space since 1995 and works with a variety of different brands here, supporting different SEO initiatives. So welcome again, everyone. Looking forward to a great discussion. So to kick things off, since a lot of times we're discussing CRO topics in this discussion, this forum, I want to give everyone an opportunity to make sure that we're all on the same page as to what SEO is and just some quick 101 level introduction. So I'm going to start with you, Wade, if you want to give us a little high-level overview of what SEO is.
Sure. Thanks, Val. SEO really is a process or a set of tactics based on increasing the amount of traffic and the quality of traffic coming from organic search results. The strategies in SEO are continually evolving. This is mainly based on the frequent search engine algorithm changes and especially to the changes to search results pages themselves, such as space reserved for paid ads, local listings, knowledge panel, answer boxes, and even zero results pages.
Awesome. That's a great overview. I appreciate that. So I'm going to give you a different 101 level question. How do we measure SEO, and how do we know that some of the tactics that we're applying in this space are working?
Awesome. Thanks, Val, and appreciate that introduction, and glad to be here, everyone. So the main metrics we use to measure SEO are organic traffic, and we also want to measure converting traffic from that organic traffic and backlinks from high DR sites. So those are the three metrics we're mainly looking at measuring SEO.
Awesome. And then Zach, I'm going to throw this last one on over to you. How would you explain SEO to my grandma?
I would say it's trying to make a website more friendly for people to understand it. It kind of at a high level there. I mean, it's really trying to take a lot of code, a lot of content, distilling it down to a simple, low grade level reading level that search engines can come in and understand and more effectively grade or evaluate your content.
Awesome. I think she'd get it. I think she would get it with that description. Thank you. And one other thing I just wanted to tease apart before we get started is when I hear about SEO, one of the things I hear a lot is that there's kind of like two schools, or maybe that's not the right word, two divisions, that there's the technical side and then there's more the content side. Can one of you talk to what you, do you feel that as like the two primary pillars, or like how do those two concepts play together within the SEO space?
I mean, I can jump in here. I would say those are definitely two of the pillars, but I would say it goes a little bit beyond that too. There is kind of the off-site authority piece that kind of blends into it as well. Normally the way we look at it is you need to have that strong foundation, which is that technical aspect of SEO, and that's making sure that your code is crawlable and understandable and readable. But then it's also making sure that the content that exists on your site is optimized towards your audience and as valuable content that can help someone. But on top of that, there are those offsite factors that include things like backlinks, or if they're a brick and mortar based business, local citations. All those things kind of work together, and really all those signals together are what search engines are looking at.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you very much for all that, and quick shout out to make sure to leverage the Zoom group chat or the TLC calls channel if you want me to throw any questions at our panelists, or feel free to take yourself off mute and we can dig into any of these topics a little bit more. So with that, now that we have a little bit of a ground level understanding, I want to dig into how these worlds collide. So first, let's talk about the negatives. So when do CRO activities have a negative impact on SEO? And I'll open that up to the floor, and then I have some specific questions that may or may not have come from past experience. Luis, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of different ways that it can collide, right? There's a specific example where when I worked at Experiment Engine and Optimizely, we ran 500 tests at Experiment Engine. At Optimizely, we were working mainly with enterprise clients. We ran less tests but more impactful tests, and the tests that typically won were copy tests. And those tests were easy to implement, really straightforward to get out the door. But a friend of mine that worked at LaunchStarter brought up a great example where he has a copy test that's winning and he can't implement it because it's killing his SEO. So, that it comes down to just being able to do the math and saying, hey, how much more traffic can I get from SEO versus how many more conversions am I getting with this winning experiment? And I think it's a bigger issue for bigger sites, but smaller sites don't have to worry about it as much.
Interesting. I'm curious about that example that you bring up. How were you guys able to pinpoint exactly that the content experiment was depressing the organic traffic within the test itself? Was it a pretty quick turnaround, or was it more of like a needle in a haystack to tie that together?
Right. So I've never ran an experiment that I've actually seen the SEO results. It's something we're obviously always been monitoring. This company is an example that he gave on a blog post. He's a friend of mine, Ryan from LaunchStarter. And what they were measuring removing Jacksonville. So they run these PPC ads. They removed Jacksonville from their headline copy. And I don't know exactly what they made their headline copy, but removing that keyword increased their conversions. They made it more tailored towards the consumer. I don't know if they personalized it. And they obviously can't remove that for SEO. They have to have that live. So it's it worked well for their AdWords copy. So they left that in their AdWords copy, but ideally if that same AdWords copy experiment can be implemented to their SEO page, it would increase their conversion, but it can't. Interesting.
I like that example.
To piggyback on that a little bit, page speed is a huge part of the algorithm these days, and a huge part of Google's reviewing of a site. Sometimes some of the things we've seen tested can tend to blow up page speed a little bit, and that will end up impacting rankings, sometimes not immediately, but in the future. But those are some of the times that people in our role have not been as accommodating with testing as we would like to be.
Wait,
Yeah,
that's
and even
such a good point. Go ahead, Zach.
well, I was going to say, even on top of that, not only just the impact on SEO from site load time performance, but the impact on the user experience and the fact that people don't want to wait for 15 seconds to load a mobile website.
Yeah, all connected, right? So I'm going to throw out some examples, and we're getting an awesome amount of questions in the Slack channel, so I'm going to pull up some of those in a second. What about penalties for a test where you have to completely create a second page and you're using your testing tool to redirect? Is that going to hurt SEO if I have duplicated content? And is there a right way or a wrong way to handle that situation?
Yeah, it's definitely something that's going to start to impact SEO. It really depends on if the second page that's created has the intention of duplicating the content of the main page, or if it's meant to be separate content to test a different approach. If it's a duplicate content situation, what's going to happen there is Google's going to start looking at both pages, and they may start to fight against each other in terms of organic rankings. And the key way to prevent that is to really look at implementing canonicalization, but not just between those pages. This needs to be kind of a site-wide effort, because if it's only on certain pages, Google may not fully respect what's going on there. But the canonical tag can basically tell Google that the URL that you're testing, that duplicate URL, is not meant to be indexed. It's meant to be seen as the same as the original URL that's there. So that can help to prevent any kind of loss of visibility from that perspective.
Interesting. So I would love to dig into that a little bit more. So I never knew that it had to be something considered site-wide. So if I'm a CRO and I'm building out a second page that's testing a different experience, and I want to make sure that I'm not hurting myself in the long run, what do I need to do, or who should I talk to? Like, tell me about how I remediate that situation to make sure that it was handled on a site-wide level.
Is it a page where you're showing a different page to each audience, or is it the same page that is being seen by? Is it two separate pages?
So for the point of this fake example, we'll say that it's a duplicated page, and what we're changing on it is some form fields and the CTA button. So the rest of the copy on the page is the same, but everything else is duplicated.
You would make sure you would have your control, then that would be what Google would look at. And so the tested version, if all you're testing is the UX or testing the CRO part of it, then we would want Google to see the variant. We'd want Google to only see the control. And so you would have a canonical tag that would go back to the control, or you would have a no index tag on the variant.
Okay, and then what are the steps at the site level? That, to me, and maybe I'm misunderstanding. I thought that seemed like page level, because I'm totally following you on that part. It's that next level that I'm concerned I'm going to miss that step.
Yeah, I can clarify there a little bit in terms of what I said before. When you do a canonicalization strategy, ideally, canonicalization should be in place across the entire site, not just instances where there is variance.
You're talking like category pages, product pages, things like that, Zach?
Well, more so like every page should have a canonical tag, whether or not there are duplicate versions of it or not, because you could inadvertently create duplicate content even if you just have a page search UTM parameter at the end of a URL. So from an SEO perspective, we always recommend that sites we work with have canonical tags throughout the site that point to the preferred version of the page. More so what I was referring to in that sense is just that should be done site-wide. If it's only done on the pages that you're testing, it can cause Google to kind of say, okay, well, you don't have these tags throughout the site. You only seem to have them on this page. We need to figure out if we actually want to pay attention to this tag or not, because Google could choose to ignore it.
And a lot of themes like Shopify, and if you get a good theme, they already have canonicalization built in there, right?
Yeah. It depends on the platform that you're using as well. WordPress by default, for example, does not. But there are plugins within WordPress like Yoast that allow you to easily add those things in.
Cool.
Nice. So I have a question coming in from the TLC Calls Slack channel. This question came from Merritt. So the question is, Google's page assessment tools always seeing sites with testing tools as resource blockers. Should this be addressed, or how would we address this issue?
It just depends on the resource. You'll never be able to free up every resource. We see GTM, DTM, all these types of resources that we really can't block. And so you really have to pick and choose. But certainly there are plenty that potentially would be in there from coding or something else, from the templates or style sheets or something that are being blocked that need to be corrected. But we've never seen a situation where all of it, you never see anything being dinged as being blocked.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. So I'm going to go into another example. I've got a laundry list. So what about a scenario, or is there any impact in this scenario, when you're using a testing tool to push an experience to 100% of your audience? So play the situation out. You have your 2 different variants, you're testing it, you come to a conclusion that your new challenger is the optimal variation, but there's a really long queue to get that rolled into your primary code base. So you're like, okay, testing tool, please serve this up to 100% of the audience. Does it depend on the type of test, or are we doing any type of long-term damage here from an SEO perspective?
It's definitely not a best practice.
Yeah.
But literally nearly every client I've worked with has done that, because that's exactly what happens. And I usually just want to duplicate that test, say that this is 100% push, rename it, say it's 100% push, and then keep it running and put it in a dev queue, because obviously you don't want to be losing money, but you want to do that for the least amount of time possible. And I think there are some other tools out there that are going to eventually solve this issue. They push the winning variant to 100%.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen situations before. I worked with a client a couple of years ago where they built a new mobile site and they wanted to split test 50%, the old site and the new site at the same time. And they put a no index tag, like what Wade was referring to before, on the new site that basically said, don't index this. And they decided, okay, this is performing better from a UX perspective. Let's switch it to 100%.
Oh, no.
What's happening now is you're now telling Google, hey, our only mobile site is this site that doesn't have any crawlable aspects of it whatsoever because we're blocking it. And the site that you're used to no longer exists and doesn't redirect at all. And that's something like in a situation where that just will tank off any organic performance that you're getting to that domain very quickly. And it's very tough to recover from that.
Yeah, as soon as you started going down that path, I thought I knew we were going and my stomach sank.
Yeah.
That's a really good call out, especially what we were talking about earlier about how do we handle when we create that second page. So,
and it's expensive. Like if you're running 100% of your traffic and you're paying Optimizely for it, it's going to cost you.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's one of those cases where you just need to really have a lot of communication going on between all the different teams that are involved with the test and making sure that everyone's clear on what's going on and the possible impacts that's going on there.
Yeah. All right, so I have another question. This one's coming from also from the TLC Slack from Christian Oliver. This is a good question. How does Google read or index variations? And you can talk about how that differs between client side or server side, or different types of tests where you're changing different parts of the page. But like, what does Google see when we're doing these tests?
Ideally nothing, right? Like ideally they're not seeing a variation.
In 100% of cases, that's the ideal state.
It can depend, I suppose. I mean, I've done a test situation before where we wanted to test something different, but it was completely different content. Like a situation where you have a page that is content about Atlanta and another page that's content about DC. And you can kind of look at testing those two pages differently, that they're both still separate content. You can test different experiences in that case. You could still index them, but it's going to be a different experience. It may not be a perfect one-to-one comparison of saying, okay, this works in DC, it may not work in Atlanta.
Were you trying to test the content to generate organic results, or were you trying to test once they landed on the page to convert them?
Right.
Because
if you're just trying to test like the conversion opportunity on the page at that point, and you're duplicating the page, then Google ideally, like you were saying before, shouldn't be seeing those variants.
What about in the cases where the content is personalized? So you're intentionally serving customized experiences either off of machine learning, or maybe it's rules-based targeting. How does Google read that, or how should we ask Google to evaluate those parts of the page?
Well, normally Google's only going to see the non-personalized version. And this is where you kind of get into more or less a cloaking discussion, which is, I don't know if people know what cloaking really is, but it's serving up one version of a page for search engines and another version for other people, for the public. And it used to be a tactic to try and manipulate search rankings a while ago. Now there's plenty of legitimate uses for cloaking, and Google even recommends it in some cases, such as these new JavaScript app sites. But
can you tell me a little bit more about that, Wade? I'm very interested. So I always thought there was no cloaking. I thought cloaking was bad. So
yeah, it even sounds bad. Sounds really negative.
Well, like with the JavaScript sites like Angular and stuff, there was like the pre-render IO, and there are these other type of dynamic hybrid types ways of rendering. And Google struggles with that, and so they even recommended that you serve server side rendering to Google, and you can do client side to individuals, to the public. Now, you don't want the versions to be different. I mean, it needs to have the same content, and you need to make sure that your I's are dotted and T's are crossed, so it doesn't come about as being manipulative to the search engines. But there are reasons why you can and should do it. Mobile site personalization is another place where we see it done pretty often, where you have one responsive site, but due to load constrictions and things like that, you don't want to serve the full load to mobile users, and so you streamline it, and so they see something that's a little bit different than the desktop users.
Yeah, I would say the cloaking's become a lot more. It really, to Wade's point, really depends on the situation. In instances like what he's talking about, like that's more accepted by Google these days. If you're going to cloak and show a completely different page and completely different content about a completely different topic to someone, that's still within Google's realm of no, don't do that.
Understood. That makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so one of the other notes that I had around this area of where CRO could potentially be having a negative impact, and I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this one, is that we're moving the cheese quite often, right? So if there's, especially for a part of the site that's like a top entry page, or it's a really popular path where you have a ton of traffic, where you can be running lots of different experiences, does that have an impact on SEO at all, or is it, I'm sure it's a case-by-case basis kind of thing, but if you could just speak to it a little bit, I would love to hear more of your thoughts.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure, just where you're making lots of changes, like does that negatively impact, outside of like user experience, do you see that in SEO being a problem, that there's lots of changes on the page?
I think it's good. You're testing things, fresh content's coming on there, you're seeing what's working. It's, Google's going to keep crawling that page as long as you're getting conversions and you're getting traffic to it. If you're no indexing it and it's not crawlable, that's obviously bad, but Wade, Zach, what do you think?
I agree. I mean, you always want sites to change and to evolve, and Google does reward that. And so, the more you can show your site as being a resource, the more Google's going to respond to that. But at the same time, if you have pages that are performing well and you're making frequent changes to those pages, then Google can look at that as being, you're trying to manipulate the situation, or you're moving the target a little bit, or this page is not as much of a resource, especially if those changes are not helping the page. But site-wide, we definitely want sites to always grow and show more value. And so doing those kinds of testing to see what works with your audience is certainly recommended and would help.
Yeah, and I think it really depends on what it is that you're tweaking, because there are certain aspects that are really important and vital when it comes to SEO ranking factors that, if you're constantly changing, let's say, a title tag on a page, at some point Google's going to get confused, and that may end up hurting you if you're constantly changing some of those fields on a page. That's kind of one of those things that we would recommend avoiding. But if it's something like, moving around a form or changing the layout of a page, that will have less of an impact than something that's more open in that area versus, something that is being looked at constantly by search engine crawlers.
That's fair, and that makes sense. Understanding like what is the critical page ranking things that we should at least be careful of when we're testing in that. So So that was an awesome discussion on some of the ways that CRO can negatively impact SEO, but now I want to talk a little bit more about like how we can avoid it, because despite what you might think, we don't want to be making these changes that make your lives harder, especially like your example, Zach, putting a variation 100% no index, no follow. So how can we avoid this? Is it more just the two groups working more closely together, that you're involved more with our test prioritization and pipeline, or could we invoke a checklist or something to make sure that we're respecting what we need to make sure that we're avoiding some of these pitfalls? What would you recommend?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one thing that we do very frequently within SDI is when we're talking about a client that's trying to do CRO but also doing SEO, we typically meet and discuss and talk through the hypothesis library of what's going to be tested and try to understand what those tests are going to do, what it's going to impact on the page, and what pages are going to be overall impacted by that change. And really just trying to identify if this has a negative impact or not. And that's really just kind of staying in communication with the team in terms of what's going on, how that test is progressing, what we're going to do next. I've definitely worked in a situation more recently where we're trying to launch a new page type on a website, and they added a form to that functions very differently from another form, but it's coded the same way. And the concern that we've got is, okay, well, we're trying to test a variation of this form throughout the site. If we launch this page, it's going to break our test. And that's a case where we were able to work with the team that was designing and implementing the test to try and find a solution that would not negatively impact organic search for these new pages, but would allow the test to continue to run without interference.
That's fair. The communication point seems like it's a key part of this from my perspective. Luis, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's absolutely. I mean, you have to have a roadmap. And I think the most frustrating thing is when you get a winning experiment and that experiment doesn't get implemented, right? So you don't understand why you even ran that experiment. So having that communication before and figuring out, okay, does this test, does it even make sense to run? And you can use, Wider Funnel has methods for measuring this. Optimizely has methods for measuring this. They call it pie charts. CXL has their own method. But you prioritize your experiments. Like what potential does the experiment have? If it does win, what kind of impact will it have on my business? And how easy is it to implement? So all those things, like take those into consideration before in this experiment. If it's going to be an SEO nightmare, maybe it's not worth even investigating it. Go after some different experiment types. It's from what I've seen, there's really no shortage of ideas to run. It's, can we execute these tests fast enough, and are they going to make an impact on the business?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first we have to do no harm, right? Like we're in the business of trying to make incremental improvements to our business. Like we should never be testing variations we wouldn't be comfortable rolling out 100%. So that's a great point to think about it during that prioritization, like actionability of this rolling out. I love that. Any other thoughts on that, Wade? And how we can work better together?
For me, it's something we hear in a lot of different realms. It's just kind of breaking down silos. I mean, you've got your development group, which a lot of times works by themselves, and your marketing department. And, depending on who's the champion of the optimization efforts, they potentially could be working in their own little silo. And then SEO obviously is in the same situation. And so certainly it's communication, but it's even more than that. It's strategy hopefully can be crossed over the different departments.
Love that. So let's say we, unfortunately for this fake example that we're going to talk about, we did not consult with our SEO experts before we launched this test. How would we know, or could we know, during the fielding time while the test is live if it was negatively impacting search? And I realize that this depends largely on whether or not we're going to allow Google to see that alternate variation, but are there any signs or anything that we could use to help us catch this before we would roll to that variation?
I mean, basically, certainly load testing, making sure that, some of the basic programming ideas are not getting, blown up or whatever. Some of the those kinds of basic things, but certainly trying to involve people who are in that area would be the best way.
And something we did in the past that was really cool and saved us from a lot of lost money was sending a Slack alert, something as simple as, hey, this experiment has reached 100 visitors. And now you go in and you check the results, make sure everything's looking good, make sure your bounce rate's looking good, and you check the page on analytics to make sure it matches. So those little Q&A procedures really, they take time to develop, but are going to save you in the long run.
Yeah, and even on top of that, I would say, we are always, as SEOs, looking at performance of a website. I mean, it's definitely become a lot more data-driven approach of how we implement practices and what we do. And, many times I've seen instances where you can start telling something's going a little wrong if you're looking at your data from an organic traffic perspective, whether it's in an analytics platform or in something like a Google Search Console, and you start seeing those variants generating organic traffic when they shouldn't be. So that's certainly something that I've seen before is, you start seeing traffic in 1 month being all dedicated to one page. And the next month, that page is now a quarter of what it once was, but there's 4 pages that are now getting traffic.
That sounds scary.
And a lot of times a staging or a QA environment can help with this. Like if a test wins, instead of it just getting promoted directly to production and goes live, if it's into the same queue as all the other development changes or updates that are in the staging or QA environment, then that does give us the opportunity to look and to troubleshoot and make sure that there's nothing that's going to cause potential issues.
Gotcha. Yeah, especially from like a performance perspective, right? That makes sense. All right, so if we don't have any other tips or tricks on how to make sure we avoid some of that, I'm going to move on to the positive side. So any last thoughts, closing thoughts on that before we talk about some fun stuff? All right, I'm going to move along then to some activities where what we do in CRO actually has a positive impact on SEO. So as we know, that Google and a lot of the search engines are looking for delivering the right content that people are searching for, and there's a big component of that is UX based. And I know, Luis, you have some thoughts on this one, but one of the quotes that I pulled was that one of Google's goals is to provide users with the most relevant results and a great user experience. And that seems to me like a place where we're all talking about the same thing. Would you agree that this is a place where these two kind of help each other?
I definitely agree. I agree that a lot of CRO is UX based, but we worked with a high traffic client, and we would test and we measured this. We would test design changes and we would test copy changes, and copy changes won most of the time. And they were an SEO heavy client, and they didn't even really measure the impact to see if their organic results were decreasing. They mainly cared about conversions coming through. And the way they worked was on an affiliate model too. So they would test their page, and 30 days later, maybe the click-throughs was one variation, but really we wanted the data from 30 days later from their accounting department to make sure it matched, and it wasn't always the case with click-throughs. But to think back, they never really measured the SEO side of it. They were really just focused on CRO. Would have been interesting to have that impact, but for them it was copy. It really wasn't the UX focus that made the big change for them.
That makes total sense. Do you think that there's an intersection then, even more so between CRO and SEO with like keyword planning and thinking about how we bring people to the page with certain content? Is that kind of where you were going with that? Or is that an opportunity?
Definitely an opportunity, right? Like we never got to work with their SEO team. It would have been interesting to work together and Wade and Zach, like silos, right?
So I guess let me rephrase it a little bit. Do you see a world where we could put together some hypotheses around validating keywords to help with the planning on the SEO side, the content planning, as well as the measuring the impact on a CRO side?
I think that would be awesome. Like, using something like Distilled's network and then combining that with, another A/B testing tool and working together to create better experiences that could definitely be where I see this going. Whether it's combining tools or go ahead.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
Also, whether it's combining tools to make it happen, or if there's one tool that does it all. I know you talked about AI and CRO before, and it's always been this hot topic. Okay, like let's find this winning variation for you, but I haven't personally experimented with that. I know like Conductrix and Gershoff do that, but I haven't seen it implemented in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to go back to that example that I referenced before of, if you want to test a different approach from an SEO side of things or from a CRO side of things, and you can test it on pages that are completely different content, but you have like a similar market that you can compare something to, or a similar page that you can compare something to, and you have your control, that's the site today, but you have a similar but different page that you can start testing different approaches to content or targeting or the user experience. That could be a way that you can actually start testing things and seeing if it has that impact on SEO. The only consideration there, though, is it takes a longer period of time for search engines to understand when you make a change to your website and what that impact's going to be. We often see that anywhere from a couple weeks to possibly a couple months. So it really depends on how long we're willing to run the test as well, and just making sure that there's the buy-in behind it to keep it running in an appropriate amount of time.
That's a really good point, Zach, because when we think about how long we're going to run a test in field, we don't always worry about some of those lagging metrics for calling the test and running our t-test on it. What could we expect, or like how would we put together the business case to put in front of someone to say this might need to run in field for a different time period, which is potentially introducing additional risk if the Challenger variations are not performing at the same level, to try to get to these long-term gains? How would we go about planning something like that?
I really think it just becomes a discussion that we set the expectation in the beginning that, this is going to take a period of time for this change to be impacted, and we have to be prepared for at least a couple of months of it running. There is the potential possibility that you can start to see some declines, and then it could start to go back up again. So the other expectation that I would always kind of express there is you're going to see some fluctuation in your rankings if your goal is to test against improving from an SEO perspective. So you just need to be prepared, like not to just cut the test the second you see it start to fluctuate a little bit.
Yeah, and we don't want to be doing that either, and all. Right. That's a no-no for us too. But I guess on a per client basis, would we be able to say like, this is the amount of time we notice changes on the site impacting the metrics around SEO? Could we say that this is about a 6-week lag for this client or this website? Or is it harder because it really depends on is it more nuanced than that, like on the page level, category level? I'm just trying to get a gut around that.
If they're a bigger brand, they're gonna, it's gonna happen faster. For a smaller site, it's gonna take longer. But I never promise like, hey, it's gonna take 6 weeks. It's like, it could take 6 weeks. It could take 3 months. It could take 6. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a matter of how much of the page is changing. I mean, if it's just a couple different things here and there, a header tag or something like that, then it might not be that you might not see a difference in any kind of length of time. But if you're changing the whole theme of the page, then you might see something change very quickly.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, even when we're selecting, KPIs on-site or downstream off-site metrics, we always have to make sure that they're sensitive enough to the changes that we're making, that we're going to notice it, but also not too volatile. So yeah, KPI selection it's a challenge, but it sounds like maybe this is something that you could test out or like run a pilot on to get people kind of comfortable with it, perhaps. Like find an area, find a place where there's some debate maybe over the content, the keyword strategy, and see how this could work for you. And you could use that as like maybe a case study internally. I'm just like thinking out loud.
I love that. It's like, we never wanted to start a test on a homepage because everybody has feelings about the homepage. So it's, it's just a page where people have less feelings about.
Yeah, we used to call the homepage the gauntlet at one of the places I used to work because everyone fought over it.
If you're trying to test something, like it's when you start working with some enterprise level clients, because I know I've dealt with a lot of large scale sites, Fortune 500 companies where they're slow to move. It's tough for them to understand and buy into a change from an SEO perspective until they can actually see the ROI with their own eyes. So we have tried to work with clients before in different situations where we say, okay, well, let's test this on a set of pages, see what the impact is. Let's set our benchmarks around rankings and traffic and performance and make these changes to those pages and see what happens as a side effect of that. To go back to the original question in terms of how long it can take, I think, Luiz, you were saying it really varies by how big the site is, how often Google's crawling it, how deep the page is on the site, and there's a lot of factors that play into that. But if we can start to set some of those benchmarks and set that sample set, then you can start to proceed and get more buy-in. I would say one of the biggest things we often deal with from an SEO perspective is actually getting clients to buy in and then implement recommendations.
Sounds like this is an area where you guys are very well versed, which is when you can see some of the results from the activities that you guys are doing. So we should take a page when we're talking about running these POCs related to the testing on keywords. That's awesome. So really quickly, there's a really good conversation going on in the Slack. So I want to go back really quick to one of our earlier topics about whether or not we want to make a test variant crawlable from Google's perspective. So there was some discussion that sometimes there are some cases where you do want that, some conversation about caching, making sure that bots and crawlers can see the user agent. Sorry, I'm trying to read as I'm saying this out loud. Obviously not as good as Kelly at this kind of thing. But what are some of the scenarios where you definitely do want that? And Luis, not to put you on the spot, but one of the articles that was posted came from Optimizely, so.
Well, anything technical, I'm going to defer to Zach, but I don't know. I can't imagine. I don't know why I would want my variant crawled until I know that it's one and implemented. I don't want to crawl. I'm happy to be corrected though.
No, I mean, I agree with that. Again, it depends on the goal of the test. If you're trying to test something and you want the variant index for some reason, then it makes sense at that point. But if you don't want the variant index, which is most of the time that we've seen from an SEO perspective, then you want to make sure that that's appropriately accounted for in terms of the testing plan.
But this is testing CRO stuff mainly. I mean, if you're testing like search rankings or what kind of template is going to perform better with actual Google's algorithm, you're really going to take a set of pages and implement one set of parameters there, and then take another set and either use it as your control or do another type of test. But that's where you're going to figure out how, in that situation, you do want Google to check out the variants. And you're not really comparing the two against each other. You're comparing them against what you think the predicted results would be before you made the test.
It's not a true A/B test, right?
Right, exactly. And so a lot of what we're talking about with the CRO stuff is will these changes blow up the search engine rankings or something like that, or will they cause negative issues? And we'd love for them to cause positive issues too. But if we really were testing hard what Google would think of a page or a set of pages, then we would do it a little bit differently.
There was a vendor that came on site when I was back at the American Medical Association, and one of our technical SEOs asked a question about this and said, like, is this going to hurt us? Is this going to add a bunch of weight to our pages? And, just like all the hard questions. And our vendor said, Google actually gives positive weight to sites that they can tell that are A/B testing. And I've heard that other people have said that too, but I have not found that research. Was that just like some myth that people were using and like
some genius CRO agency, like, hey, this is what good.
But was that a total myth, or like, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, Google will not tell you one way or the other. They try and hide their algorithm like Coca-Cola did its formula for its soft drink. I mean, it's not something they want publicized. But Google does its own testing. I mean, you see it on search results pages all the time where they're testing various, numbers of paid ads and local results. And
they have their own testing tool.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And so I don't know if they would give you benefit for it, but they would give you benefit for finding UX improvements that help. I mean, the easier you make things people to navigate, find resources and that kind of stuff, you're going to get better results.
I agree.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say.
I'll defer.
I was going to say, at the end of the day, it's really, like, you're not doing this to please Google though, right? You're doing it to make more money from your website. And like when you said you had a vendor, it reminded me of like one of my favorite test types. It's a vendor verification test. So, it's an easy test to do. A company we worked with, the Chivery, they had 700 different vendors. And this particular example, I'm always going to remember because it was such an interesting test. We're looking at it every day. And we removed reviews and questions and answers from their product pages. They had a third-party vendor. It was costing them $100,000 a year to maintain this. And removing the reviews allowed them to speed up the page, which also, you know, helps with CRO, but they didn't really care about the impact of SEO because it was saving them $100,000 a year. They didn't, you know, and most of their traffic and conversions didn't come from SEO. So for them, it was a no-brainer. This is speeding up our site. It's saving us money. You know, it's gone. So they didn't look at it SEO, CRO type. They looked at it money type.
Yeah, I think, you know, I've never, Val, heard them say that, you know, actually just testing for the sake of testing is going to positively impact the way that Google looks at your site. What Google has stated before, though, is that, hey, you know, we actively test changes around UX, and we know that you guys are as well, and we are certainly comfortable with that. And, you know, they've kind of basically said, you know, it makes sense that you're testing. You should be testing because you need to make your site better. But I haven't truly seen them come out and say, you know, just testing as a whole is making you better. Google hasn't specifically stated it because that's kind of the fun part of working with Google is they don't. But oftentimes we see that, you know, UX factors start to kind of play in a little bit in terms of really how the page is being looked at and evaluated. There are different patents that are out there now in terms of how Google can look at different user experience types and what's going on there. And, you know, we do think that that plays a factor there. So even though, you know, testing for the sake of testing may not be a side effect, the impacts of the changes that are being made from any conversion rate optimizations can overly impact the organic search side of things, just as a side effect of any positive change that goes on there.
Love that. Love that. So back to your example, Luis. Now you have like my mind spinning, and I had some questions for you guys about specific ideas around tests we could do to help illustrate some of the impact on these things, on SEO and some of the indicators. If we ran a test, like let's say there was a test where your client had a bunch of images that were not optimally served up in the page, and they were adding a ton of weight to page speed. Could you test another version of that page where the images are optimized, let's say for mobile and not super large, whatever? Could that be a way or a proxy to prove out how page speed impacts conversion? Is that
you could, but just improve the page speed, right? Like it's not going to hurt anything. You don't want to waste your time running that kind of test. Just optimize the images, get that page loading faster. It's just a best practice.
Totally agree that is a go do it kind of thing, but let's pretend that we're talking about a very large site that has a lot of images that are not optimized. And so there's this whole, like, you need to prove it in order to get it on the roadmap, because even though you know that, everyone on this call knows that, maybe the person who's making that call on resourcing isn't bought in on the exact impact of like milliseconds on conversion.
I would show them an infinite list of blog posts and say, you have to you have to believe this. Like, you know, Amazon has published studies on it and everything, but I think that would be a fun way to go and test it out and see.
But I wouldn't be doing an A/B test if you really had to test it like that. I would be doing it like you'd have a set of product pages or whatever that had the high res images, and then a set of product pages with the quick loading images, and you could measure an improvement with the ones in the quick loading images.
So the only pushback that I would have to that is, like, the whole idea of controlled experimentation is that we try to reduce as many extraneous variables as possible. And so you could poke more holes in something that wasn't like a nice comparison between the two. So again, I'm just throwing this out there. I don't even know if anyone would ever do this or if it makes sense. I was just wondering if that would be a proof point, because Luis, I get it. Like, there's so much research out there that says that this stuff matters, but if everyone was doing it, it wouldn't be something we could take advantage of, right? We wouldn't have so many SEO projects on our plate if everyone had perfect images.
That's so true.
Okay, so I know that there's some new trends as there's more search facets and more advanced features on search engine result page, some of those answer boxes as an example. And like some of the new goals are to be in position 0, to be the one that answers the question. Is there any way that CRO could help play a role in figuring out how to help better answer people's questions for getting into that, to be the one that gets into that answer box?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Google responds to the questions that it thinks people are getting results from. And so if you can create a format for an answer page that is something that Google can read easily, or the wording is clear enough that it responds to what Google thinks people are asking as far as the question is concerned, then for sure you can improve your chances of getting on position 0. But at the same time, position 0 is a lot based on the overall site's reputation. And so, you're not going to get a mom and pop site that doesn't have a lot of history and a lot of brand recognition in that industry to rank at position 0 unless, for quite a while. And I don't think CRO testing would help there.
It's adding schema markup too, right? So
for sure. Yep, that's necessary.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's kind of the example I was referring to before, where like we were trying to test an instance on an enterprise level site, and we were trying to test implementing structured data and the impact it could have there. And that's one of those things where you can look at the impact of the structured data on the pages.
I love that.
And what we started seeing with that case was we started getting more answer box results as a result of having that schema on the page. So it was one of those things where, yeah, it helped us prove that point, but also helped us to prove if you do this with your site's authority, you can start to rank in this area and really perform very highly for it.
Awesome. What do you use to measure the answer boxes? Ahrefs, or is there?
So we have several tools that we use at SDI that track rankings across the board, that also account for things like answer box visibility or just general knowledge graph, and those other SEO kind of snippets that show up in ranking pages. Ahrefs is a decent one. SEMrush is a decent one as well. But there's a wide variety of ranking tools in the industry that are getting smarter at understanding how to show the visibility of those facets.
Yeah, because to your point, Luis, that's a little bit harder to measure, because if you've answered the user's question on the search end result page, then they're not going to click through, or there's less incentive to, right? They stay there. So it does get more complicated, right?
That's what everybody's freaking out about.
Yeah. I would rather own it and have my visibility there, though, than someone else own it and I get nothing at all.
Absolutely.
Bingo. All right, well, we have like 3 minutes left. There's, like I said, great conversation going on in the TLC calls channel. Does anyone want to come off mute to talk about some of the articles that you guys are posting in here and talking about the way Google handles some of these details around testing? Not everyone at once. No? Okay. All right, well, then I'll close it. Oh, yeah?
I'll go ahead and ask my question again.
Awesome.
I think I wrote too much of a paragraph for you to read it all. So my question is on Google seeing the test versus not seeing the test. A lot of testing tools, and the article I shared from Optimizely was their statement of, hey, we look at user agents and we block out any known crawlers and bots and spiders and stuff. So with that being like the default behavior of any testing tool, or a lot of testing tools, and at the same time, not wanting to hide from Google, and Google maybe seeing that as cloaking, is that concerning in any way, or is Google just gonna? Does Google do anything to like sidestep those types of filters and sniffers on user agents?
Not normally. I think it probably adheres to those in most situations. There are real people who look at it, and you could potentially get hosed that way. But I don't think that that's really a concern. I think the main reason that Optimizely those tools are doing it that way is so that the variant doesn't impact the rankings of the control until the test is either proven or disproven.
Yeah, I would say it's almost a side effect of everything working together, because I've worked a lot with clients that are running Optimizely tests, and in those situations, yeah, they do have that crawler agent sniffing and kind of really directing of how things work at that point. But at the same time, if you're doing things correctly foundationally, things like your canonicalization tags, then even in that situation, if Google did somehow bypass that, then hopefully that still doesn't become a problem. It's really just making sure that foundationally across the board that you're doing as much right as possible so that Google sees the right information.
That makes sense. And I'm sure there's like, this is just go back to the point when we were talking about some of the ways to mitigate these things. It sounds like it's a good discussion to have because there's so many differences. I talked a lot about the example of having 2 separate pages, but I actually feel like I've not done a ton of those when I think about the percentage of different ways that tests get executed. So it sounds like there's a lot of nuance to this, that a good conversation with the person who's leading the strategy internally is probably a good step in making sure that we're headed in the right direction. All right, well, with that, we'll close it off. So thank you, everyone, for an awesome discussion. Zach, Louise, Wade, thank you for all of the wisdom you've imparted on us in relation to SEO, and hopefully we can all carry on and take advantage of these new best practices. Have a good one, guys.
Thanks so much.
Thanks very much.